Afternoon, everybody. If you could kindly take your seats, we'll start in the next little bit now. It's great to see so many people today, so thank you for having me. My name is Andre. I am with the Alberta College of Social Workers. I'm a registered social worker, and we're a public policy partner with Parkland Institute, so we're happy to support this great day in the next couple of days. And I just want to recognize all the organizers and the volunteers' work that have been a huge hard work to have this next little bit planned out. So yes, a big round of applause for everyone at Parkland for this. So thank you. So it is my privilege and honor to introduce our two next speakers. So we're in the environment session again. So our first speaker is Gwendolyn Blue. So Gwendolyn is an associate professor in geography at the University of Calgary with appointments in the Faculty of Science, Natural Sciences Interdisciplinary Program. Formerly trained in the field of cultural studies, she conducts research in 3 interconnected areas: public controversies involving science and technology, public engagement with science and technology, and 3 political, cultural, and post-structuralist traditions in science and technology studies, political, cultural, and ethical dimensions of scientific and technological innovations. Her research draws on post-structuralist traditions in science and technology studies and political ecology. And then our second speaker is Ian Urquhart. Ian Urquhart was a member of the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta from 1987 until 2018. His primary research focuses on the political economy of exploiting natural resources. His 2018 book, Costly Fix: Power, Politics, and Nature in the Tar Sands, was described in the Canadian Journal of Political Science as a powerful, provocative contribution to the tar sands literature. So without further ado, please help me introduce our next couple of speakers. Thank you.
Hi everyone, how's that? Is that good for sound? Okay, excellent. So thank you everyone for coming, and to Parkland Institute for the opportunity to speak. I also want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, and I am very honored to be welcomed here to present. The topic that I'm going to give today has come out because I felt in many ways it was an area that has been missing out of our conversations collectively at Parkland Institute conferences. And it's not, my first title, Democratizing Climate Change, is perhaps not that contentious, and we have talked quite a bit about democracy, so that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about something that's missing. Although I'm going to talk about climate change specifically, I'm going to also broaden this to have other public issues that involve science and technology. And environment, although I'm slotted under environment, the focus of my talk today is going to be directly addressing issues of science and also issues of expertise. And I think that in many ways we've come to some strategies collectively, whether we've done that explicitly or whether we've had those handed to us, that there's certain ways of responding appropriately or progressively, if you will, to issues that involve science. And I want to put on the table some ideas about what that might look like, some of the challenges that I've seen, and why I think that we need to take issues of science and technology seriously when we're dealing with environmental issues, for one, but when we're dealing with issues of democratization, for another. So that's the premise of my talk. I'll start off. This always feels like when it's an environmental topic, if I actually could tell jokes better, I would start with a joke, but unfortunately, I do have to state this, that I probably don't need to tell you that the news around the environment is bad, but I will anyways, just because I must. Last year alone, we had record-breaking storms, forest fires, droughts, heat waves, and floods across the world. And I would mention that all of this is at what we can estimate at about 1 degree Celsius average warming from above pre-industrial levels. The recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has talked about what we should be, according to this esteemed body, be aiming at politically is a target of global warming that's at 1.5 degrees Celsius, so no more than 0.5 degrees average temperature rise. And this is down from their other estimate of 2 degrees Celsius. This warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and there's different estimates in terms of when we would actually reach that, but it's by the end of the century, will have substantial consequences across all domains of life. And the watermark that I have on here is just a picture that was taken from the California wildfires. And if you've been following that news, it really is unbelievable. It is. We are in a state. Some people say this is the new normal, but we're on the way. This is not the new normal at all. This is the transition. This is the transition, and where we're going, none of us know. And I'll say that although our models are getting much more refined, much more sophisticated, and we have remarkable scientific knowledge on climate change, we still cannot predict the future. And while documents like the IPCC's recent report, that is a real clarion call, and a clarion call to do things differently, these reports are also tend to be quite conservative in their estimates. So I think that this is really chilling, and something to, well, I suppose chilling in the face of a warming world. But I think something that we really need to be taken seriously. And I just want to pull up a comment that Janet Brown made this morning, that in Alberta and elsewhere as well, that there's concerns of the economy are eclipsing concerns over the environment. The environment doesn't even seem to register in terms of public opinion polls. This is across the board with the environment, but with issues of climate change as well. We just did a brief media analysis looking at issues around forests, actually, and climate change. And what we found is that although there was some mention of forest fires in the media, there's been a dropping attention to forests, and very, very little connection between forest fires and climate change. So climate change is in many ways, if it's on the agenda, it tends not to be linked to issues in a substantial way. And we do have a lot of strange silence around climate change, even though it is arguably, I would say, one of the predominant issues of our time. So one of the things that the impact of this report is that we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that this requires rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all of society. Now, something that I think is kind of funny, because I should tell a joke. We're going to have a collective conversation about this in my department. I'm in a geography department, and none of us could find the time away from our research to come together to talk about these rapid and unprecedented changes that we need, even though we are supposedly teaching the next generation. So I'm going to come back to that problem, because I think it's really, really important. I think it's also important to recognize that we're seeing some rapid changes. So as we speak, there are some massive protests happening in London around trying to bring attention to mass extinctions, because as we know, climate change is obviously not just an atmospheric issue, not just an environmental issue, but also affecting all life on Earth. And so we do have some protesters that are coming out talking about democracy, so some change happening. I just want to make a nice a tie to the previous panel discussion. So I hope Emily does not mind that I took a quick snap of her slide and stuck it into mine. But Emily Eaton and Ian Hussey's fantastic discussion about energy makes an important tie to what I'm discussing. And again, these issues of democracy really central to that, and needs to make fundamental changes. So as we do a just transition, to also think about issues of decolonization alongside issues of decarbonization. I'm going to keep my pictures on this one limited, because We also, on top of our environmental problems, which I don't need to tell you, we also have significant political problems that have been summed up under this banner of post-truth. And we are seeing the rise of authoritarian, radical right-wing parties and governments across the numerous continents in ways that is very disturbing. We're seeing active ideological and politically driven efforts to delegitimize climate science, and I know that people who have who speak up in the name of climate change receive quite a hard time online in terms of the threats that they receive, and it is really difficult to be a climate scientist at this time. Some claim that this new era is called a post-truth era, in which emotions and opinion have replaced facts in public decision-making. And we're seeing a lot of authoritarian tactics, hostility towards the media, blatant misrepresentation of events, and just rampant propaganda coming out from certain politicians who will remain nameless at the moment. And people have said that in some ways, who knows what's causing this, but some people have said it's a social mediated world in which truth and falsehood circulate unvetted, and people are unable to make distinctions between what is true and what is false. Citizens, apparently in a post-truth era, are soaking up information and unable to decipher this thing called truth. So if post-truth is the problem, then what is the solution? And I'm going to make a link from our conference last year that a lot of people are saying that what we need to do in this post-truth era, particularly when we have scientific issues like climate change on the agenda, is that we need to turn to scientific consensus, to trust the consensus, and also to trust the experts. So we had a very excellent presentation from Stefan Lewandowski last year, echoing a position that others have taken, such as the historian Naomi Oreskes, claiming that we right now need to trust in scientists, and we need to trust in the scientific consensus. I think that this notion of trust in experts is a really strong value for many people. It came up this morning in the plenary discussion, and I just want to make this quote is almost a word-for-word quote that in response to having expertise, the comment was, we would like to have grown-ups in the room make the decisions. I thought that was funny, and that's great. It's wonderful, and it's really problematic for democracy, and that's what I want to talk about as I move forward. Some psychologists have gone so far to say that what we need to do is to inoculate the public against misinformation about climate change, or just like we would get an inoculation for the flu. And if you haven't done it yet, please do it, because I didn't, and I'm suffering as a result. But apparently now we can have some strategies that we might be able to inoculate ourselves against misinformation. So there's a study if you would like to follow up on it. Just a couple things. Again, I'm mapping this broad landscape, but in health sciences we see these issues as well. This isn't just tied to the environment. Timothy Caulfield, a professor of law at the University of Alberta, wrote in Policy Options that in 2017 we need to take back science and really put science front and center in our decision making. And as well, we've had the March for Science across North America in terms of scientists really very concerned about cuts to funds and realizing that scientists do need to have a voice as political actors as well. Another thing that we have seen is an incredible amount of innovation in democracy, and not just thinking of democracy in terms of voting, but efforts in deliberative democracy and bringing people together and getting people to really grapple with some of the trade-offs and issues that come into play. And these formalized kinds of initiatives can look like citizen juries or citizen panels. This is a picture of an event that I took part in 2009, just in advance of the Copenhagen talks, where we brought 100 people from Canada to Calgary to talk about about climate change to give their opinions. And in total, there was over 4,000 people from around the world who participated in this. It was a really exciting event. We've had numerous other ones in Alberta. Edmonton is, I think, can pride itself on being an innovator in citizen deliberation, whether that's through Alberta Climate Dialogues or through a lot of the initiatives that the city has done. So we've had an incredible amount of opportunities to provide opinions if you so desire. A recent initiative, Alberta Climate Narratives, has brought Albertans together to understand what are some of the values that are galvanizing Albertans around climate change. Some of you may have been a participant in those climate narratives, and we're still waiting back to hear what the dominant narratives are, but it'll be really interesting to get a snapshot, something that takes us a little bit deeper than a public opinion poll, where we can make some meaning together. I'm not going to say too much about Alberta's climate leadership plan because our next speaker is going to talk about that in a little bit more depth. But I do want to give a call out just that we have since 2015 had a remarkable initiative in terms of climate leadership. Rachel Notley has taken a lot of flack for what she's done under the banner of climate, but I think it's important to give her credit for pulling off a really important achievement, both in creating new policy frameworks as well as political leadership in bringing people together who hadn't come together before. And the engagement around the climate leadership plan was really quite remarkable. This is just an example of all of the initiatives that came together in a very short period of time. So we're seeing democracy and in action, and I think something to note, our previous climate plans had not had this level of engagement. So I think that is absolutely significant. So this might be a formula. It might be a good one. More science. Plus, and I always, when I talk about citizen deliberation in a formal way, like to use a sticky note, because most of the times I've been involved in citizen deliberation, there's sticky notes, so hence more citizen engagement equals better democracy, right? Not quite. I wish it was that simple, and I think that is an important goal to offer. Of course, we need to have experts informing us, and of course, citizen engagement is important. But one of the things that's missing from those accounts, and missing from, I think, a lot of the very important work that has been done, is attention to this pesky little problem that I call scientism. Others have called it scientism too, and I just want to let you know that when I talk about scientism, I don't mean good science. I don't mean people who pay really close attention to their methods, to good operations of data collection, to proper communication, to recognizing the uncertainties and limitations of any kind of research. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about scientism. By scientism, I mean a certain way of thinking, a certain tendency to grant authority to quantitative science and to the experts that are authorized to produce it. To define, and we give this authority, sometimes often unwittingly, to scientists and to quantitative science to define the meaning of public issues, and particularly public issues that involve science and technology. I'm not calling them science-based issues intentionally. I'm going to call things like climate change a public issue that involves science and technology because it involves a lot more than just science and technology. And one of the things that characterizes scientism is the idea that quantitative science is beyond reproach, that peer review, for example, is infallible, and that only scientists can and should tell us what to do about public issues that involve science and technology. Scientism is a belief in science regardless of the quality of the methods, and I think that is really quite important. And it's also a tendency to view facts as isolated from their conditions of production. So what I see in Alberta, and I think that this has stayed in place regardless of who's in power, is this deeply entrenched institutional imaginary. It's not just Alberta. It's across Canada. It's at our global levels of governance. And there's an idea that experts are sufficient. We don't really, and particularly scientific experts, we don't really need to ask hard questions of our experts. But what we do need to do is put a lot of focus on public deficiencies and an assumption that the public is inherently deficient in knowledge and that experts are inherently sufficient in policy relevant knowledge is something that I think that we need to be a little cautious about and more nuanced about. So one of the things that scientism does is it puts us into some dichotomous ways of thinking about public issues, in ways that get us into kind of an are you with us or against us kind of mentality. So we can think of this in terms of climate change as the believers of climate change or the so-called deniers of climate science, the allies of science or the so-called enemies of science. I've just put a couple pictures in here just for some fun. But the interesting thing is that what happens in politics is that we actually are sorting people this way. We're putting people into whether we believe that they're the good guys, so to speak, or on the other side, the bad guys, the climate deniers. So here I've got some very, perhaps some obvious pictures. I'm going to poke fun at our neighbors to the south. I put Gwyneth Paltrow in there because if anyone knows Tim Caulfield's work, that he has been quite concerned about some things that Gwyneth Paltrow has said about health. I've also put Bruno Latour in there because he's a French philosopher of science and technology who some people think is an enemy of science. Now, the problem with that kind of sorting the world, I'm sure we all like to sort into categories, is that people like me, who are critical social scientists, started out in science, but then crossed the great divide into the social sciences. We've also been called the enemies of science. These are just some books. Trump in the Post-Truth World says that post-truth is brought to us by critical sociologists and also right-wing politicians. The War on Science by Sean Otto is another person who is saying that not only that critical social scientists are the problem, but that we should also be rooted out of universities and fired. And if any of you are remembering the science wars in the 1990s, we had exactly the same thing. So that this kind of sorting the world based on science can have some very serious implications in terms of critical thinking. We're also seeing a phenomenon that's coming out that some people have become the self-appointed science sheriffs who are drawing the line between who can and can't speak on climate change. So some scientists who have been raising perhaps some concerns about what it is that we're doing with climate change in terms of public policy, or perhaps saying that we need to open up what we mean about a scientific consensus to look at some dissenting views, have been not invited to conferences, not published. And I know this is something that we often hear from climate deniers, but it is something that is a thing. It is that there are self-appointed science police. So we did hear at our last conference the importance of a scientific consensus and following, and I think that is really important. But we also have to have the judgment of when to follow a consensus and when not to. Scientific consensus does not necessarily mean truth, and scientific consensus can be overturned. So I just want to say that it's important that we also look at dissenting voices. This is just one article that challenges that notion that we should trust a scientific consensus, and in instances when it is judicious to challenge the scientific consensus on climate change. And I will say that all of these people, the pictures that I put up on the board are leaders in their field, and none of them are climate deniers, and yet they do challenge the scientific consensus. Some other things that I think that we need to look at, and this is a paper that came out of Nature, a conversation just trying to really get a conversation going in science about the crisis in scientific institutions. There are problems with science. In some cases, the scientific elite is inextricably linked to centrist free market political establishments, and there are perverse incentives that can happen in scientific fields. A constant pursuit of funding. There can also be a reinforcement of the status quo among scientists. And so this is a difficult conversation to have, but people are trying to have it within science. And that, what I said there was just a very quick summary of what is in this article in Nature. And so I think that the idea that we're in a post-truth era suggests that at one point we actually had this very pure access to truth, but knowledge and politics have always been intertwined. I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are issues of harassment and discrimination in science. The Me Too movement, which has spurred Much attention is also going on in science, and many women scientists are now coming out and saying their stories, and their stories haven't been one of equality. Their stories have been ones of challenge and difficulty, and I invite you, if you know female scientists, to have a conversation of if they have experienced harassment and discrimination. And this applies to minority groups as well. So science itself is not perfect. Now, one of the problems if we give too much power to science and technology to define public issues is that the issues that matter to certain publics can be prematurely left out of politics. And so one of the things, and this is coming out from a science policy scholar by the name of Sheila Jasnoff, is that in many ways one of the challenges that we have, and this takes the challenge to a new level of difficulty, I think, is that it's not just that we can turn to science, but that we need to reinvent our practices of governance in the interest of building more just and inclusive and promissory futures. And I want to just give a quick overview of what that might entail. First of all, input from experts is absolutely essential. And I'm going to say a diverse range of experts, but experts should not be immune from critique. And so here again, in The Guardian, talking in terms of health issues, but equally applicable to environmental issues, scientists aren't gods, and they need to be held under scrutiny. And I would add economists and psychologists as well, social scientists as well. And that notions of public deficits, this idea that there is, that I hear this quite a bit, that we exist within this system of beliefs that keeps us from the real truth, it's a very simplistic notion, and is something that is called a public deficit notion. The real truth is not that clearly stated, and if we assume that we can look to one group of people to give us the real truth about the world, we're handing over a lot of power. We live in worlds of uncertain risks, and we have uncertainty paradoxes that we need to grapple with. Science is often asked to give certainty for public policy. Certainty to us, because I think we've lost a lot of institutions. We don't want to lose faith in science, and yet science can't give us certainty. The best that science can help us do is to grapple with uncertainty, and particularly around issues like climate change. And so I think that we need to be really careful about what it is that we're asking scientists to give us. I think some skepticism towards expertise is a sign of maturity, and it's not a sign of barbarism. Framing is not just for the domain of experts, and here I want to talk about the importance of politics. And what I mean by framing is just this tendency to direct attention to some things and not to others. And so politics is all about framing. How is it that we create our issues? What kind of symbolism do we give around these issues? Alberta's Climate Leadership Plan, again, I think it's a really important plan, but it has been framed in a very narrow way. It's been framed in a way that foregrounds the economy. It also assumes that competitiveness is the core value that must be implicit within our approach to the environment. I'm not entirely sure that that's a value that I sign on to. So I think that's something that we should be discussing, not necessarily just being taken for granted. And also this idea that continued economic growth is necessarily for the public good is something that we should be discussing rather than accepting and embedding within our public policy. Climate change, of course, has facts, but it also has policy frames. And I think we need to realize that the facts that we have about climate change are embedded within numerous ways of framing the issue. Just a couple of examples of how we can frame climate change differently. We don't just have to think about it in terms of a very narrow economistic lens, but we can think about it through a range of different kinds of options. And I would like to see more of us put justice on the table. So to conclude, scientism is a barrier to democracy. So I think that we need to be able to recognize scientism and to be very nuanced in our approach to it. I think that democratizing, I pose this as a question, but I will, my response would actually be an affirmative yes, that democratizing environmental issues means democratizing science, but that is not an easy task. As an institution, science is necessary for environmental governance, but we do have to recognize that it has limitations and exclusions. I'll leave just with a quote. I love this quote coming from a philosopher who's talking about the importance of science and human values. Has there ever been a society which has died of dissent or critique? Perhaps not, but several have died of conformity in our lifetime. Thank you very much.
go forward is to get that forward. Thanks very much. Good afternoon. This is the mic. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ian Urquhart. Where do I want to begin with this? I guess what I wanted to start by saying was that judging by public opinion polls, virtually all the Albertans who do put environment at top of mind would seem to be here this afternoon. So thank you. Thank you very much for coming out. Good. Thanks. Yes. That's okay. I got this. Okay, because I can't see that far anymore. I don't have Gwendolyn's eyesight. The good, the bad, and the ugly. No, this is not a review of a Clint Eastwood movie. I wish it was. That would be a happier tale, I think, to tell this afternoon than the one that I'm going to be presenting you with. So essentially, what I'm trying to do is I want to look at the record of the New Democrats with respect to environment. Not surprisingly, that's a record that overlaps considerably with what the New Democrat record is with respect to energy, particularly the tar sands. Okay, so this is how I'm going to approach it. I want to say a few words about the idea I used in what I've written about this, namely market fundamentalism, as being important, something that we should consider, something that today I'm going to try to suggest to you helps us understand the differences between the good and the ugly. And that essentially has to do with distance from the oil and gas economy. I want to talk about some good things I think that the government has done. There are others I could add to this, but I'm not going to. Time is short. The Castle Parks, I'll say a few words about the Castle Parks in southwestern Alberta. I'll say a few things about climate change, particularly the renewable electricity program. I won't say anything about energy efficiency Alberta. I wish they were getting more money than they are today, because they are the branch of government that is largely involved with things like solar micro-generation on rooftops, that sort of approach to renewables. The bad, when it comes to the bad, see the good, because I'm going to pick holes in what I see as good. I'm going to try to suggest some ways in which I think the good could have been even better than they were. And the ugly is greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals of the so-called climate leadership plan. You know, and it's funny, Gwendolyn's absolutely right in talking about where we focus our attention in the post-truth age, but everyone does it. Trudeau does it. And as much as I respect Premier Notley, she does it too. In terms of the words they use, words matter. And they often select words that, in my opinion, don't necessarily fit particularly well with what I regard as the objective reality. So I'll talk about greenhouse gas reduction goals and the tar sands therein. Like Gwendolyn, I'd like to, before I get into this in any detail, I'd like to, as she did, acknowledge the fact that we're on Treaty 6 lands, and I for that, for our ability to be here. I do look forward to the day, though, when university presidents can stand up in front of audiences like this and actually say something other than, I'm just really glad to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 lands. I really look forward to the day when we see some substantive offerings to free tuition, for example, for Indigenous. Anyways, there's another issue. Okay. The importance of market fundamentalism. I mean, this is an idea that I ran across in the work of Fred Block and Margaret Summers. This is an approach to understanding what's been going on in the West for the last generation or so. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has described it as a prevailing religion in the West. And the reason I like people like Block and Summers, the reason I like the phrase market fundamentalism is because it does have a religious aspect to it. It does have sort of, it's a belief, it's a faith. And don't challenge the faith is the message that market fundamentalism has to offer us. It's an idea, though, that I think you can trace to some liberal political economists, Charles Lindblom, for example, radical political economists from a generation ago, like Fred Block. And essentially what market fundamentalism does, it just imprisons the way we think about all our public policy problems. The market's a constant. The need to maintain business confidence is a constant. It's not a variable. And as a consequence, any sort of policy proposals that you develop that you want to see acted on have to respect that, have to respect the fact that the market's a constant. It's not something that we can tinker with to any great extent. It begets, the market system begets demands for free markets, but it also begets demands for pro-business state intervention. From those who out of one side of the mouth of some people in the corporate community, the argument will come about how important free markets are. On the other side of their mouth, they'll be talking about the need for state intervention in order to support their businesses. You're seeing a contemporary example of that right now in energy with the demand for what from the oil and gas sector, from tar sands producers, some of them. Cut production. You know, will the government just help us out of this situation by intervening in a way that will increase the price that we get for our product? So it's, in addition to deregulation, and I think one of the things I really liked about the work of Block and Summers was they used this phrase, re-regulation, as well to describe what they think has been going on in countries like the United States. There's one example, I just gave you one example of how we see demands for re-regulation with respect to cutting oil sands, tar sands production. We saw it big time in the 1990s with the tar sands royalty changes that were made in the 1990s. They took an already generous regime and they made it even more generous. And you're not getting the idea that it was an already generous regime from some wacky professor like me. This is what government officials said about the previous regime. As well, on the environmental side, with respect to tailings ponds, we've seen the same phenomenon. If industry can't meet tailings ponds reclamation standards that are outlined in Directive 73, what do? We change them. We soften the directive. We make it easier for companies to comply. And on the environmental side, in the Alberta tar sands, that's another good illustration of this phenomenon. And you know, maybe this is just really simplistic. You know, and you might just say, well, Jesus, I mean, you know, I thought you were going to say something that was original. But like in Alberta, this notion of market fundamentalism really means that if we're going to see strong environmental protection and policy, it's going to occur the farther away we can get from petroleum, the farther away we can get from the tar sands. Okay, so the good. The good is the Castle Parks down here in southwestern Alberta. If you don't know, if you don't know where the Castle Crown Wilderness is, that's where it is. The Minister of Environment, Shannon Phillips, in the headline to her press release in September of 2015, said that Alberta was going to fully protect the Castle area. Boundaries were set in January of 2017. We now have a management plan in place earlier this year. What you have over here, it's really hard to see, I realize, but the darker green is the wildland park that was created. The light green is a provincial park that was created through these measures on the part of the government. The castle is a really special area. It has somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 rare and at-risk species in Alberta hang out in the castle. It's part of the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. which a variety of environmental groups have been urging should be protected for any number of years now. 75% of the intact grizzly bear habitat in this region has been compromised by this point in time. So not only is it a significant area for species, but it's also an area that's under great threat. The threats come from, in the northern part, from forestry, which, in case I forget to say it later, to their credit, the government has no more forestry going on in the castle. They get a big, congratulations for that. And on the other side that they don't get such a big congratulations on, the other thing that's really damaged the ecological integrity of the area is off-highway vehicle use in that part of Alberta. But the good news is, through the initiative of the Notley government, we have a provincial park, an expanded wildland provincial park in southwestern Alberta, that has protected, in some fashion, 1,000 square kilometers of territory. So that's a big, it is an important win. As much as I have complained about it for nearly 3 years, I acknowledge the fact that it is an important positive initiative that we should value and cherish. Okay, the other good thing that I want to concentrate on or mention is the phase out of coal-fired electricity plus a renewable electricity program. I think these are the most positive elements of the climate leadership plan. What I've tried to do in this slide is give you some idea about just how significant coal was, and with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. I won't talk about the public health issues. People like Joe Vipon have written extensively about the public health and how important it is to get rid of coal for those reasons. But in 2016, half of the electricity we generated, half of what's going on in here came from coal-fired electricity. It was our second largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and because coal has played such a significant part in Alberta's electricity generation system through our history, we do more of it here than the rest of the country combined with respect to coal-fired electricity. So total phase out by 2030. One of the things I'm not sure I first ran across it in something Gord Laxer presented a couple of years ago, but it was reaffirmed there, is that the total phase out of coal, should really take credit for 6 of those 18 plants, not 12, not all of them. And what I mean by that is 12 coal-fired electricity generating plants in Alberta were already scheduled to be closed by those nasty Harper Conservatives by 2030. They were going to be shut down. But the government, to its credit, took on the other 6 and said, no, you've got to shut down your operations as well. And it's significant. I mean, 38 million megatons of greenhouse gas emissions were due to coal. Now, some of them we're going to get back because we'll replace it with natural gas. Okay, and so the phase out of coal was good. The flip side of that is the introduction of a electricity program. You see the renewable side focus on wind, which is yellow. 9% of capacity, generating capacity in 2016 was from wind power. By 2030, the Alberta Electricity ASO, whatever that acronym means, the people who run the show, say that wind's going to get to 24% in terms of generating capacity. Coal, 38% here in gray, gone by 2030, taken right out of the picture altogether. And the red is natural gas. So with the elimination of coal, we're going to see more natural gas generation in Alberta, but we're also going to see a significant increase in renewables, particularly wind. That's where we think we're going to get most of that. Most of that is going to come from. Okay, the bad. The castle again. I edit this magazine for Alberta Wilderness Association. I asked the question for those at the back, what's wrong with this picture? Molly and Bessie hanging out on a lovely alpine meadow in Alberta. Should they be there? No, but they get up there to get away from the bugs. They get up there to get away from the bugs sometimes. So anyways, the point is, so that's, when you go to enjoy the castle parks, you may see Molly and Bessie sitting up on the ridge that you're going to get up to, because the government just grandfathered in cattle grazing. Okay? People have been doing it there for years. Why not just continue to allow them to do it? So cattle grazing is one of the activities that, in my view, doesn't have any place in a provincial park, compromises the goals of biodiversity and watershed protection that the minister herself said were so important to creating these parks. So the bad with respect to the castle is the fact that the government is still going to allow any number of activities that compromise ecological integrity. Forestry's gone, I've said that's a good thing. But with this photo here, this is a snowmobile or quad crossing. Okay? They are still, the management plan that came out in May proposes to phase out over the next 3 years all OHVs in the castle. That would be a good thing, but why the hell wasn't it done in 2015 or 2016? Like, I don't want to be a pessimist, but if the New Democrats aren't around in 2021, do you think Jason Kenney is going to be phasing OHVs out of the castle? The New Democrats missed the opportunity to do more with respect to ecological integrity in the castle than they did. So those are the sorts of quibbles I have there. And also watch out, because there could be like white guys hunting in there too. So that's another thing you got to take into consideration when you go into the provincial parks. Anyways, I will move on. The bad with the renewable electricity program, God, there are a lot of words up here. We have a system, an electricity generating system, that is centralized and dominated by large-scale players, large-scale utilities. That's what we're getting with the renewable electricity program as well. The reason wind is going to go from 9 to 24% is because utility-scale wind farms are going to be the norm. We're going to get quite a few of them under this particular program. So I think we missed an opportunity with this phase out to try to get a more decentralized electricity generating system in Alberta. One where, let's use the space we're already sitting on, buildings downtown Edmonton, my house, whatever, and put things like solar on those, and make more of an effort to do that. Now the government has. So this is a situation where Urquhart's saying you should have done more, okay? Because I would like to see more of that. I would like to have seen us think about actually rethinking how we do electricity in Alberta, and we haven't really done that with this particular program. There's also the business about, no, hang on, you get to talk later. There's also the business of, like, what about other values, other environmental values like biodiversity, for instance. So far, wind energy developers have targeted Alberta's grasslands in the south. At this point in time, they've either been approved or they're before the Alberta Utilities Commission, projects that would cover 1,350 square kilometers of grasslands in southern Alberta are being earmarked for wind farm development. Now, 2 cities the size of Edmonton could fit in that area. 10 Lethbridges, 10 Red Deers could go in that area. It's huge. It's a very significant part, and it's a very significant part of Alberta, not least because this is the part of Alberta where most of our species at risk are found in the grassland. This is the part of Alberta that is one of the least protected parts of Alberta are native grasslands. Okay. And the other thing that really, I got to get going because time's running out here. This is the one thing that a lot bothers me, as you can tell. So part of my carbon taxes now are compensating Capital Power, TransAlta, and ATCO Power for the questionable coal-fired electricity investments they made. Like when they said, oh, we're going to build, despite what's going on in the world, climate change, Gwendolyn, what the hell's that? No, we're not worried about that. Never going to happen in Alberta. They might have been right about that. Anyways, the point being that they were going to, they're going to make these investment decisions about new coal-fired electricity generating facilities. We, through our carbon taxes, are buying them out of those bad decisions. We will pay a total of $1.358 billion over the next 14 years out of carbon tax revenues. And if you go back and look at what's said about this in the 2017 provincial budget, and the reason given for this is not respect for contracts. I mean, maybe that's part of it, but the reason given for this is to promote investor confidence. Okay. So you made a bad decision. Aren't you lucky you made it in Alberta? Because we're gonna compensate you for that bad decision you made a few years ago. Okay, the ugly. Now this is the record the NDP inherited, and I'm going to go over this really, really quickly. Premier Notley was dealt a terrible hand. There's no doubt that the progressive Conservatives during their tenure deserved the label climate change laggards. They deserved that in spades. Total Alberta emissions in 1990, 174 megatons. 2015, 267 megatons. Much of that increase of nearly 93 megatons came from petroleum. I think that's about 58% came from petroleum generally. 57% of that increase comes from tar sands. Okay. So, what a record. I mean, what a record to have to deal with. That the Notley government that the Notley government inherited. It was terrible. So the ugly begins there. But unlike some others, I think when it comes to climate change ambitions, there's room to be critical of what this government has been doing over the past few years. There are some statements from the Environment Minister and Premier Notley. We have a world-leading, a continent-leading climate leadership plan that is reducing emissions on a number of fronts. Said that earlier this year. Shannon Phillips tweeted joyously when they thought they had John Horgan done in British Columbia that we have a climate plan that sets the bar for the whole country. If that's true, I'm going to have no problem jumping over that bar. I mean, that's how low it is. I mean, it's because these are our ambitions. We essentially, so this is from the climate leadership document. Our world-leading climate change plan essentially sets what we're doing in 2015 as what our 2030 target should be. There is no significant reduction at all in today's levels, from today's levels. And real greenhouse gas emissions are going to increase, there's 1990, remember Kyoto? Here's 2005, remember Copenhagen? I mean, those are the years that most nations use to talk about reductions relative to emissions in either of those baselines. In Alberta, the real greenhouse gas emissions, the increase from 2005 is only 17.7%, but where we are at today is 56% higher than what our emissions were in 1990. Now, what does the phrase world leading mean if that's the goal, if that's the ambition? Like, I don't think it means a hell of a lot. It doesn't. You hope people like us, you hope people who are, you hope the public is going to accept it and applaud you for your efforts. The ambitions aren't very ambitious. And then we have I mean, the reason for this, the reason why I would say there hasn't been a lot of real leadership on climate change, is that the Notley government has been nearly, if not just as beholden to the tar sands as the Progressive Conservatives were. The Notley government's approach to the tar sand only calls for them to limit future emissions, growth, not to reduce emissions. Reduce emissions growth, not reduce emissions. The two are qualitatively hugely different. The climate leadership plan fails to offer real reductions for the reasons that Gwendolyn identified earlier, competitiveness. We will free ride, in other words, if we can, on the efforts of other countries and other places when it comes to climate change. So what's staggering about this figure to me, and remember, like, we're reducing coal by 38 megatons. What's stunning about the Oil Sands Emissions Limits Act, geez, language doesn't matter these days, is it sets 110 megaton plus, doesn't include cogeneration and what happens there, cap on tar sands emissions. 61% increase in emissions can come out of that sector of our economy compared to what was emitted in 2015. You know, our approach to the tar sands, I mean, the tar sands reign continues unchallenged. I mean, they were able to increase their emissions by what to my mind is a pretty staggering 61% out to 2030. Dr. Paul Booth used to be in the economics department here. No friend of the political left in Canada by any stretch of the imagination, but Paul, as a former Deputy Minister of Environment Canada, talked about the staggering increase in oil sands emissions that this entailed. Okay, so you know, I'm not what I tried to do in my mind when I was thinking about this was to try to compare the castle and climate change. And make the point that really, I mean, you know, this notion of market fundamentalism, you can do more where the big corporate actors aren't involved. Even with, but you know, as I noted before, you have to compensate them if you're doing something like the renewable electricity program. But you know, I thought I'd end with this, and you know, in 2009, this is what the Premier said in the House when she was going after Environment Minister, Renner. Why won't you admit that your intensity targets are nothing more than a laughable smokescreen that nobody is going to buy except your staff, and that does nothing to address climate change? If we had an opposition party in the legislature in Alberta now that took climate change seriously, they could ask the very same question of either the Premier or of Minister Phillips. You know, we really haven't gone anywhere on this file. And I think what makes me angry, the thing that makes me angry about it, other than the fact that I have now 2 grandkids who are going to inherit the mess that we're leaving for them, what makes me angry about it is we are told that we are world leading. We are told that we are continent leading, when I think any objective look at the facts says something totally different. Anyways, I hope I cheered you up this afternoon. Thanks very much.
Perfect. So we are now going to move into the last little bit with the question and answering period. But before we begin, being mindful on page 7, I will follow those guidelines for discussion and again, ask questions brief and ask them appropriately, and we will have some good conversations. So I'll start on this side. Paul, can you, with the person in the gold shirt.
I'd like to ask about, is this on? I'd like to ask the, I've lost your name, I'm fighting cold, but the male presenter, Ian. I want to ask about, I want to ask about what you're saying about the ugly, because we, have a house in Calgary. 9 years ago, we put on 4.2 kilowatts of solar at our own expense. Cost us about $40,000. This spring, we put on 5.5, a little over 5.5. Cost us $16,000 because of the government rebate. And so that government rebate for solarizing, for microgeneration, has been there. And one of the things that surprised me is how little attention it seems to have got in the media, in the general public. And I want to ask you, I'm sure you were aware of it, but you didn't mention it, because I too believe that centralization is not the way to go, particularly with what we're going to face with climate change. We have to have our electricity everywhere, not in one spot. But for us, it seemed like quite a significant move. But we did notice, because we've done fundraisers for the NDP, that they don't seem to make a big thing of publicizing it. And I don't think enough Albertans have taken advantage of it. Can you comment on that?
I mean, really quickly, I mean, that's a great example, and you epitomize what I wish we see more of. The problem with the residential program was, now I might have the numbers wrong, but I'm pretty close. The amount that was set aside for the residential solar program was about $31 million. Okay. That doesn't offer that opportunity to a lot of people to do that. So, and that's where my complaint comes from. Like, I think what you've done is great. I mean, I had solar on my house here in Edmonton long before there were any government, incentives to do that. But, so I'm a good person. But, I think it should have been more, and for all sorts of reasons. It also creates more jobs. Anyways. So why haven't they done more of it? Well, maybe because it was only a $31 million program. Maybe they said, oh, we've only set aside this amount of money. Then as well, and we should all know that there's one for Indigenous communities. There's also one for municipalities as well. But given the absence of funds, maybe they didn't want more people to know about it. But that's even too cynical for me to suggest, maybe.
On that same topic, I have 20 solar panels on my house. I put them in 2 months ago. And Premier Notley introduced energy efficiency in a different scale recently, very recently. Mm-hmm. What are you going to say about that? Because that is involving all the tall buildings in the province, all the institutions, the government buildings, corporations, and they have to. First, they give a proposal to the government, and that it's done by individual. Each one is individually considered for energy efficiency. Is that not going to be a good move?
You'll have to after we're done, you'll have to show me where I can get that information, because the only two recent announcements I'm aware of is the fact that Alberta Infrastructure has said that they're going to purchase their energy from renewables. Okay, so Alberta Infrastructure said that. And Energy Efficiency Alberta announced that they would be increasing the amount that microgenerators get from 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour to 9 cents a kilowatt hour. But I haven't heard anything at all about, the NMAX building. Well, mind you, they're into solar. I haven't heard anything at all about corporations having to put solar on their roofs. I know nothing about that. So if you can tell me what that is after, I'd appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gwendolyn and Ian, for your presentations. And hopefully in my question, I might be able to link both of your presentations. But I'll start off in terms of some of the questions that came to mind from Gwendolyn. That is, what is being democratized? Is it science? Is it citizen participation? Is it both? And here I'm going to a point that was made by Louis Cardinal last night, important of learning from other societies and other, he mentioned particularly the Indigenous peoples, that we don't just meet them on the bridge and say hello and go back to respective corners, that we incorporate their worldviews. So Indigenous peoples all over the world have a knowledge about the environment, about climate and climate change. It's an expertise, you might say, but also it's linked to their worldviews. And it's also a critique of capitalism because they don't see the nature as a commodity. They see it as living and sacred. So I just wonder in terms when we're considering your presentation, how do we go about incorporating Indigenous knowledge and world views, and where would you place them on your spectrum in terms of science? Is it creating alternative science, or is it just another, we lump them in with citizen participation, or is it both? And so thank you.
So that's a very good question, and one that's really hard to answer quickly. So I don't mean to be glib in any way to give a response, but I think these are some of the issues that are being worked out, particularly at a global level. The IPCC has a lot of faults, but one of the things that it has done really well as a global institution is to find ways to bring different kinds of knowledge together. So when it started in the 1990s with its first report, it was strictly a scientific set of reports, and it has opened up to be able to grapple with issues of how do you deal with other ways of knowing. And I think oftentimes we do that very superficially. So we'll say, okay, here's our science, we're going to bring Indigenous knowledge together, and everyone's going to be happy, and we're going to hold hands. And that's not the case, because in many ways, Indigenous ways of knowing, even if we take spirituality as a core component of some Indigenous ways of knowing, that does not align with Western scientific ways of knowing the world. And so we do have these, and I don't mean to use academic words, but I'm at a little bit of a loss, incommensurate ways of knowing. So we can't measure them with the same ruler. The problem is that many of our institutions are built, and particularly environmental institutions are built around Western quantitative science, and particularly risk-based approaches. And so issues around uncertainty, issues around dealing with issues of meaning are not well grappled with within our institutions. And so we need to be building new institutions alongside us answering these very questions that you've put on the table. And so the IPCC has done it well, doing it, I'm not saying perfect, but around biodiversity loss, we're also grappling with this. So I think that these are issues that we're going to have to grapple with, because we do need to make decisions collectively. But what I want to put on the table is that our existing institutions may not be necessarily adequately up to the task to do that. I don't know, Ian, do you want to know?
Thank you. Perfect, thank you. Just to be mindful, we have at least 5 more minutes.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Gwendolyn and Ian. This was really informative. My name is Julie Hrdlicka, and I'm a trustee at the Calgary Public School Board. And I really appreciated the comments around, the idea around learning, the work that we're doing in science around climate. It is a learning that we're all doing. And where I'm challenged with the government in some of the policies that come forward is, as you've talked about, is these are the answers, this is what we're doing, and we're going forward. And so I'm not seeing a lot of reevaluating the policies that we're putting into place. And in particular around the carbon levy, public services are being impacted by the carbon levy, but we have no way to capture more revenue to cover the costs that we're paying out. So what it's doing, it's actually doing, when we're talking about trying to gain public support for things like the carbon levy, it's doing the opposite. Because people are upset that money's coming out of the public classrooms in order to pay for carbon levy, and we're not getting the money back or the grants back from the province to recoup that. So, I really appreciate the discussion, because even though we put some of these policies in place, you talk about the castle, when do we revisit those policies, see what's working, reevaluate to make change? And just wondering your thoughts on that.
I'll just give a quick answer, and then I'll pass it to Ian too. I think that the carbon levy is a really interesting example of how, in many ways, we have turned to again an expert consensus. Again, this time the consensus of economists. And again, I'm in principle a supporter as a tool. But I think there's a lot of questions that we really need to be asking about how it is that, how and when and where we we put a carbon levy in place. Unfortunately, what we didn't do at the right time was ask questions about what should be that distribution of payment. And I think we should have had the question on should the large emitters should those who cause the most historical problems actually be paying the same as the rest of us, more than the rest of us, or less than the rest of us? And the way that our current carbon competitiveness regulation, and I think that even the name of our regulation, the previous SGER has now been renamed to the Carbon Competitiveness Regulation, which I just think is something that we should all be very upset about, or at least talking about. And we haven't had that conversation because right now, trade-exposed large emitters pay by proportionally less than we do as citizens. So we are basically shouldering the cost. We are socializing the risk and privatizing the profit. So absolutely, I wish we had mechanisms to revisit these, even when there is a scientific consensus that this is the right way. Can we move forward and have really important, sophisticated conversations about the consequences and nuances?
I mean, what Gwendolyn just said about the old SGER and now the carbon competitiveness regulation, I mean, and it will be a huge issue, I think, going ahead into next year. It's something that I think Kenny can use and will use if he goes ahead with his sort of approach. But, I think your question just underlines how there needs to be a greater need. Transparency has been a word that's been talked about and used a lot. And I think with something like the carbon levy, okay, or the carbon tax, that there hasn't been as much transparency around the programs. I mean, some of the like how did Andre's group get a grant and mine didn't? Like where are the what's going on here? Why is he the chosen one and I'm not? I think there is a need with the program just overall to be much more transparent in terms, and the budget isn't going to help you. I've tried, and it doesn't have as much information, I think, as we really should have about these programs. The good thing when the Premier very, very cleverly called this revenue neutral, okay? But not in the sense that most people who've talked about carbon taxes use the phrase revenue neutral. I mean, usually it means if we're going to tax your use of carbon, we're going to reduce some other tax you're paying. Well, that's not what the Premier meant. She meant it was deficit neutral. That, in other words, everything that comes in will go out. But should there be more transparency about the programs? I think there certainly should have been.
We'll have one final question. And then maybe with the final question, you can say your last comments.
Ms. Blue, I was kind of confused about your section on scientism. In particular, you had a slide up there that was saying, or suggesting to me anyways, that there was some disagreement on the consensus of climate change. Did I read that correctly? To me, the consensus is the planet is warming, humans are causing it, and it's a problem, and we need to do something about it. So could you clarify that particular slide? Because if there's some proof otherwise, it would be earth-shattering, and we'd be talking about something completely different today.
No, it's a good point to clarify. And what I was talking about is this argument that as a public democracy, that we should put our public policy decisions in the hands of a scientific consensus. That is the underpinning argument that is being made by people like, say, Naomi Oreskes. In the case of climate change, that one, because frankly, the scientific consensus on climate change is a very low bar. And no, there is no disagreement about the fact that most of the warming that we've seen has been anthropogenic. I think we can agree with that. And there's no problem in that case of supporting that scientific consensus, in my opinion. But I'm not going to take the position that we should always inherently support a scientific consensus and let it guide our public policy simply because it is a scientific consensus. What we need to do is be more nuanced in under what circumstances was the consensus drawn, what are some of the divergent arguments. And so my point would be that we need to take, in a very measured and rational sense, account of all of the different arguments, not just trust and let a consensus guide us, because it is a consensus. So I hope that clarifies what I'm talking about. It's about what is the place of science in terms of how it is that we frame public policy. A scientific consensus can be overturned, and I think we need to take that into account. And so the question becomes: do we leave public policy framing in the hands of experts? And I think that that is not a democratic way forward. But I'm setting this is a very high bar to say that we need to have reasonable, rational, nuanced, and sophisticated debates about the place of science in democracy. And I know that's a big challenge, but I think it's important that we challenge ourselves as well.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Ian, do you have any final comments or anything you'd like to make?
On behalf of both of us, then I'd just like to thank you for deciding to spend some of your time here with us this afternoon. Thanks very much.
Perfect.